He challenged an alien hunter. Her response blew his mind, and what happened next was beyond imagination. Jake thought he had the upper hand when he taunted the fierce alien warrior, Vyxara. Little did he know, her answer would flip everything he thought he knew about survival. When a cold-blooded predator's fury mixes with something far darker, the results are explosive, and this battle between them was just the beginning. What happened next? You won't believe how their deadly game changed the fate of both worlds. Want to find out how far this wild ride goes? Hit that subscribe button and join the adventure. You don't want to miss what happens next. Trust me, it's going to leave you speechless. Jake snapped awake, his body screaming in protest. Thorny vines wrapped tight around his wrists and ankles, their venom pulsing into his skin, numbing his limbs with a slow, creeping sting. He was trapped in a stone cage, swaying over a jagged abyss on Kyra Prime, a planet that felt like it wanted him dead. Below, the jungle snarled with the cries of unseen beasts, their roars clawing up the rocky cliffs. The air hit him hard, damp earth mixed with a sharp, bitter tang of alien sap that burned his lungs. 2 red moons glared down, their bloody light seeping through cracks in the stone, casting twisted shadows across his bruised chest. He was hurting bad but alive, and that was enough to keep fighting. The cage jolted as a figure stepped into view. Vyxara. Her metallic purple skin gleamed under the moons, shimmering like molten steel. Tight leather armor clung to her like a second skin, hugging every curve. Her hips, her chest, all of it outlined in the faint red glow. Her crimson eyes blazed with hate, locked on him like he was prey. She crouched low, claws scraping the stone, her voice a growl that hit him deep. "Humans," she hissed, "you're filth on the galaxy's boots. I'll make you bleed till you beg." Her lips curled, showing sharp teeth, and damn if it didn't stir something in him he couldn't explain. Jake forced a smirk, his voice rough but steady. "Bleed me all you want," he said, eyes raking over her. "If I'm dying, at least I've got you to stare at. Not a bad way to go." He wasn't lying. Pain or not, she was a sight, all deadly curves and fire. Her eyes flared, and she lunged closer, claws inches from his throat. "You dare mock me?" she snarled, her breath hot against his face, close enough he could smell her, leather, sweat, and something wild. She straightened, towering over him, her shadow swallowing the cage. "You're the last of your pathetic crew," she said, venom dripping from every word. "Your Earth fools came to take our world. Now they're meat for the beasts, and your mind to break." Her voice cracked, raw and personal, like this wasn't just a job. Jake's mind raced. His team had been hit hard days ago, ambushed in the dark. He didn't remember much, but her tone told him this was deeper than orders. "You sound pissed," he said, shifting against the vines, wincing as they dug in. "What did we do to you, huh? Steal something you liked?" Her fist slammed the cage, rocking it over the drop. "You kill my blood," she spat, her voice shaking with rage. "My family, gone because of your kind." Her claws flexed, and Jake caught it, a flicker of pain behind the hate. He hadn't been there, hadn't seen it, but someone in his crew must have crossed her. Guilt tugged at him, but he shoved it down. No room for that now. "Well," he said, leaning forward, voice low, "if you're settling scores, make it good. I don't do half-assed." Vyxara's eyes burned hotter, and she stepped in close, real close. Her chest brushed the bars, her heat radiating through the cold stone, her scent flooding his senses. "Good?" she whispered, her voice a dangerous purr. "I'll carve you slow, human. You'll scream for me." Her claws hovered near his neck, teasing the skin without cutting. Jake chuckled, rough and low, his heart pounding. "Scream? Nah, but keep talking like that, and I might start enjoying this." She froze, her breath hitching, caught off guard by the defiance. The air thickened, heavy with something unspoken. Anger, sure, but something else too. She pulled back, muttering in her tongue, leaving him dangling there, pulse racing. Whatever she had in mind, it was going to be a hell of a ride. The cage rattled as Vyxara stormed back, her boots slamming the stone with a force that echoed through the cavernous platform. Jake's arms burned, the venom from the vines sinking deeper, turning his hands cold and numb. But he forced himself to sit up, chest out, refusing to look broken. She stopped just outside the bars, her crimson eyes locked on him, fierce and unyielding, like she could peel his defiance away with a stare. The silence hung heavy, the only sound her shallow breaths and the distant growls from the jungle below. Then, without a word, her claws slashed through the vines, cutting them loose with a vicious snap. They fell to the floor, and Jake grunted as blood surged back into his limbs, a sharp, electric sting racing through him. Before he could move, she grabbed his torn shirt, yanking him out of the cage and throwing him to his knees on the rough stone. "Stand," she snarled, her voice low and dangerous, vibrating in the thick air. He stumbled up, legs shaky but stubborn, and met her glare head-on, his jaw set. She stepped in, too close, way too close, her body pressing into his, heat pouring off her leather armor. Her chest pushed against his, firm and deliberate, the tight leather creaking as she moved. Her claws dragged slow and deep across his chest, slicing through the shredded fabric, drawing thin lines of blood that ran hot down his ribs, soaking into his waistband. She leaned in, her lips brushing his jaw, her breath scorching his skin as she whispered, "Beg me, human. Beg, and I'll make it quick. Spare you the slow bleed." Jake gritted his teeth, the pain sharp but nothing next to the fire of her body against his. "Not happening," he said, voice rough but steady, staring into her blazing eyes. "You're too into this, rubbing up on me like this. What's it gonna be, huh? Kill me, or keep playing?" He pushed forward, his chest pressing harder into hers, his hips brushing hers in a bold, taunting move. Her eyes flared, a flash of shock cutting through her rage, and she growled, slamming him back against the stone wall. His spine hit with a dull thud, knocking the air from him, but he grinned through it, blood trickling down his stomach, staining the floor beneath them. Her hands pinned his shoulders, claws digging into his flesh, drawing pinpricks of blood. Her hips pressed tighter, her thighs sliding between his legs, rough, intentional, daring him to flinch. "You're a corpse with a mouth," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury and something raw, something she couldn't bury. Her breath came fast, her chest heaving against his, leather straining with every rise and fall. Her thighs shifted, pressing harder, and he could feel the heat of her through the armor, her scent flooding his senses, leather, sweat, and that wild edge that made his pulse race. "Then why are you still here?" he shot back, voice low and teasing, leaning into her grip. "You want to break me, or you want to feel me up? Pick one, Vyxara." Her breath caught, a sharp hitch, and for a moment she froze, her body flush against his, her claws twitching at his shoulders, her thigh locked between his. Her eyes darted over him, furious and conflicted, caught in the storm he'd kicked up. A hologram flickered to life beside them, blue light slicing through the heavy air. Three masked figures, the Kyra Council, glared from the screen, their voices cold and commanding. "End him, Vyxara," one barked sharp and final. "Don't shame us with this filth any longer." Jake laughed, a rough, defiant sound that bounced off the walls. "Shame? I'm the best damn thing you've seen, and you know it." Vyxara's head snapped toward the screen, then back to him, her claws sliding up to his throat, hovering there, trembling faintly. Her body didn't pull away, still pressed tight, her heat sinking into him, her hips brushing his again as she shifted. "You're nothing," she muttered, but it sounded weak, her voice cracking under the weight of her own lie. Her chest rose and fell faster, leather creaking, her thighs still pinned against him, daring him to push back. Jake tilted his head, voice soft but cutting. "Then why are you shaking, Vyxara? Scared you're liking this too much. Mia, do you like this?" Her growl rumbled deep, primal and furious, and she yanked him off the wall, throwing him back to the stone floor with a force that rattled his teeth. He hit hard, coughing, but kept grinning up at her, blood smeared across his chest, his eyes locked on hers. The council's voice cut through again, colder now, dripping with menace. Kill him, or you're done. Everything you've built gone. She froze, claws flexing, her body still hovering over him, dangerously close. Her chest heaved, her thigh brushing his hip as she leaned in, her heat and anger a tangled mess. Jake wiped blood from his lip, smirking. Go on, he said, voice steady. Make it fun. I dare you. Her eyes burned, caught between rage and something darker, something she couldn't name. And he knew he'd pushed her right to the edge. Wherever that led, it was going to be one hell of a fight. Vyxara towered over him, her claws poised at his throat, her breath coming in short, jagged bursts that matched the pounding of Jake's heart. He stared up, his smirk unshaken, blood dripping from the cuts she'd carved into his chest, pooling in dark streaks on the stone. The council's hologram flickered beside them, their masked faces glaring down like executioners waiting for the kill. Do it, one snapped, their voice a cold whip through the thick tension. Prove your worth, Vyxara, or you're nothing to Kyra, less than the dirt under our feet. Her jaw clenched tight, her crimson eyes blazing with a fury that could have lit the platform on fire. And for a split second, Jake thought she'd do it. Slash him open, spill his guts in a quick, bloody end. But her hand shook, claws trembling just shy of his skin, a crack in her steel he could feel. She stepped back, dragging him up by his shirt with a grip that bruised his ribs through the torn fabric. You don't deserve quick, she snarled, her voice thick with frustration, rough with something she couldn't shove down. Her claws flashed again, slicing through the last scraps of vines still clinging to his wrists, freeing him with a vicious swipe. Then, with a brutal shove, she sent him stumbling toward the edge of the platform, his boots scraping the stone. Below, the jungle sprawled out, dark and alive, its red-lit canopy swaying like a sea of jagged teeth, beasts howling in the distance, their cries clawing up the cliffs. You'll run, she said, her tone icy but fraying, edged with a heat she couldn't hide. The hunter's sentence, Kyra's ritual. I'll tear you apart myself, rip you to shreds under these moons. Jake caught himself, teetering on the brink, his legs screaming from the venom's lingering sting. He turned, facing her, the abyss breathing cold up his back. A hunt. Huh, he said, wiping blood from his mouth with a grin that refused to fade. Better be fast, Vyxara. I don't die easy, and you're starting to figure that out. Her name hit her like a spark, and her eyes flared, rage boiling over. But something else flickered there, something that lodged in her chest like a thorn. She took a step forward, claws twitching, her body tense and coiled, every muscle screaming to lunge. But he didn't give her the chance. He leapt, diving off the edge into the dark, crashing through vines and thorns as he slammed into the jungle floor below. The impact stole his breath, pain exploding through his chest and thighs, but he rolled to his feet, adrenaline roaring through him. Branches snapped under his boots, the air thick with the jungle's humid reek, rotting leaves, sour sap, and the musk of predators stalking closer. Above, Vyxara's silhouette stood sharp against the red moons, her chest still heaving from their clash, her fists clenched tight enough to crack stone. Run, you worm, she shouted, her voice tearing through the trees, fierce and wild. I'll rip your spine out and leave you for the beasts. But there was a hitch in her tone, a crack he'd forced into her with every taunt, every push. He laughed, a raw, defiant sound that echoed back to her, dodging into the shadows as the jungle swallowed him whole. Catch me if you can, sweetheart, he yelled, his voice bouncing off the cliffs. I'll be waiting. Don't leave me hanging. She watched him vanish, her pulse hammering, his damn smirk and that cocky laugh burning into her skull. She'd hunted plenty, humans, monsters, anything Kyra threw at her. They all broke, all bled out screaming. But him? He was a flame she couldn't crush, and it drove her mad. The council's hologram buzzed one last time, their voices sharp and final. Don't fail, they warned, then blinked out, leaving her alone with her fury and that unwanted heat he'd left simmering under her skin. Jake hit the ground running, his boots pounding the damp jungle floor of Kyra Prime as thorns and vines clawed at his legs. The air was thick, humid, choking him with the stench of rotting leaves and sour alien sap that stung his nose. Above, the twin red moons cast a bloody glow through the dense canopy, turning the shadows into a maze of jagged shapes. Trees twisted like skeletal hands, their branches dripping with glowing moss that pulsed faintly in the dark. His chest, burned from the cuts Vyxara had left, blood soaking his torn shirt, sticking to his skin, but adrenaline kept him moving. The venom from the vines still lingered, a dull ache in his limbs, but he'd be damned if he let it slow him down. She was coming. He could feel it, and he wasn't about to make it easy for her. The jungle roared around him, alive with the snarls of unseen beasts, their cries bouncing off the cliffs that loomed somewhere in the distance. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, made his pulse spike, but he kept his head clear. He'd survived worse. Crash landings, firefights, ambushes, but this was different. This was personal. Vyxara wasn't just some hunter. She was a storm of rage and heat, and he'd gotten under her skin back there. That laugh he'd thrown at her, that taunt, "Catch me if you can, sweetheart." It was a spark, and he knew it had lit something in her she couldn't ignore. Good. Let her chase him. He'd turned this hunt into her nightmare. He ducked under a low branch, his boots sinking into the soft, mossy ground, and risked a glance back. Nothing but shadows and the faint red glow. But then he saw it, a flicker of movement, fast and sleek, cutting through the trees like a blade. Vyxara. Her metallic purple skin caught the moonlight, shimmering as she moved, her leather armor hugging her tight, outlining every curve as she darted between the trunks. She was a predator in her element, silent and deadly, her bow slung across her back, claws glinting at her sides. Jake's grin widened. "Come on, then," he muttered under his breath, picking up his pace, weaving through the undergrowth. A sharp whistle cut the air, and he dove just as an arrow sliced past his shoulder, embedding into a tree with a dull thunk. The tip glowed faintly, dripping a green liquid that hissed as it hit the bark. Poison, no doubt. He rolled behind a thick trunk, heart pounding, and peeked out. She was closer now, her crimson eyes glowing through the dark, locked on him like a beast tracking blood. "Fast, little bastard," she called, her voice sharp and taunting. "Carrying over the jungle's din, you think you can outrun me?" Her tone was cold, but there was an edge to it, something less certain than before, like she was testing him, not just hunting. Jake laughed, rough and loud, letting it echo back to her. "Outrun you? Nah, I'm just warming up, Vyxara." He bolted again, ducking under vines, his boots splashing through a shallow stream that shimmered red under the moons. The water was cold, soaking his legs, but it gave him an idea. He veered toward a narrow cave mouth he spotted ahead, half hidden by glowing ferns. If he could get inside, he might turn this chase into a fight on his terms. His lungs burned as he sprinted, the sound of her pursuit growing louder, branches snapping, her boots hitting the ground hard, her breath a faint hiss in the air. He dove into the cave, sliding across the wet stone floor, and scrambled to his feet. The space was tight, damp, the air heavy with the smell of moss and minerals. Water dripped from the ceiling, a steady plink-plink that echoed in the dark. He pressed himself against the wall, catching his breath, blood still dripping from his chest, staining the stone beneath him. Then he heard her, boots crunching outside, slowing as she approached. She stepped into the cave mouth, her silhouette framed by the red moonlight, bow in hand, her chest rising and falling fast. "No more running," she growled, her voice low and dangerous, but her eyes flickered. Doubt, maybe, or something else. Jake grinned, stepping out of the shadows. "Good," he said, wiping blood from his lip. "I was getting bored." Vyxara stepped deeper into the cave, her bow lowered but her claws out, glinting in the faint red light that seeped through the entrance. The space was tight, the walls slick with moisture, closing them in together. Jake stood his ground, his back to the stone, blood dripping from his chest, his torn shirt hanging off him in rags. His legs ached, his breath came hard, but he kept his grin, eyes locked on her. She moved closer, slow and deliberate, her leather armor creaking with every step, her metallic purple skin shimmering like liquid fire. The air thickened, heavy with the heat of her presence, the drip of water from the ceiling the only sound breaking the silence between them. "You're done," she said, her voice a low growl, but it wavered just a little. She stopped inches from him, close enough that he could feel the warmth rolling off her, her chest brushing his as she leaned in. Her claws grazed his arm, not cutting, just pressing, testing him. "No more games, human. I'll get you here." But her eyes told a different story. They darted over him, searching, like she wasn't sure what she'd find. Jake tilted his head, smirking. "Gut M.A.? You're taking your sweet time, Vyxara. What's holding you back?" Her growl rumbled deep, and she lunged, slamming him back against the wall with a force that knocked a grunt out of him. Her hands pinned his wrists above his head, claws digging into his skin, drawing thin beads of blood that ran down his arms. Her body pressed into his, hard and unyielding, her chest against his, her hips grinding into his, her thighs slipping between his legs, rough and deliberate. "You're a pest," she hissed, her breath hot against his neck, her lips brushing his skin as she spoke. "A worm that won't die." But her grip tightened, her thigh pressing harder, and he could feel her trembling. Anger, sure, but something else too. Jake laughed, low and rough, pushing back against her hold. "A worm, huh? Then why are you shaking, sweetheart?" He shifted, his chest pressing into hers, his hips bumping hers in a slow, taunting roll. "You're all over me. Can't decide if you want to kill me or keep me pinned like this." Her eyes flared, and she snarled, her claws tightening on his wrists, but she didn't pull away. Her breath came faster, her chest heaving against his, leather straining as she leaned in closer, her lips hovering near his, close enough he could taste her heat. Wild, raw, untamed. "You're nothing," she spat, but her voice cracked, weak under the weight of her own words. Her thighs shifted, sliding higher, pressing into him with a slow, deliberate pressure that made his pulse spike. Her hips brushed his again, rough and needy, and her eyes locked on his, furious, conflicted, caught. "Then finish it," he said, voice dropping low, daring her. "Or admit you're liking this, me under you, fighting back." Her growl turned into a sharp hiss, and she released one wrist, her claw sliding down his chest, tearing through the last of his shirt, leaving it hanging in strips. The fabric fell away, and her hand lingered, claws grazing his bare skin, tracing the lines of blood she'd drawn earlier. She pressed herself tighter, her chest crushing into his, her thigh locked between his legs, her heat sinking into him. "You're a fool," she whispered, her voice trembling, her lips brushing his jaw as she spoke. "A dead fool who doesn't know when to quit." But she didn't strike. Her claw hovered, her body stayed, and her eyes flickered with something new, doubt, maybe, or a crack in her hate. Jake pushed forward, breaking her grip on his other wrist, and grabbed her shoulders, spinning them until her back hit the wall. She gasped a sharp, startled sound, and he pinned her there, his hands on her arms, his chest pressed to hers. "Maybe I don't quit," he said, voice rough, his breath hot against her neck. "Maybe I'm not the one who's dead here. You're the one hesitating." Her claws flexed, digging into his sides, but she didn't push him off. Her hips shifted, brushing his, her thighs still tangled with his, and her breath hitched, caught between rage and something she couldn't name. "You're fast," she muttered, her voice low, almost a confession. "But I'll still kill you." Her eyes burned into his, but her body stayed pressed to him, trembling, unsure. Jake grinned, leaning in closer, his lips brushing her ear. "Prove it," he whispered, his hands tightening on her arms. "Or keep me here. I'm good either way." The cave seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with their heat, their clash, and for the first time, Vyxara didn't have an answer, just a shaky breath and a fire she couldn't put out. The cave trembled as a low, guttural roar echoed from the jungle outside, shaking the stone walls around them. Jake held Vyxara pinned against the slick rock, his hands gripping her arms, their bodies still pressed tight, chest to chest, hips locked, her thigh caught between his. Her crimson eyes burned into his, wide and wild, her breath ragged as the sound grew louder, closer. Before either could react, a massive shadow loomed at the cave mouth, a hulking beast, its scales glinting red under the moons, claws scraping the ground as it lunged. Jake moved first, shoving Vyxara aside and diving as the creature's talons slashed through the air where they'd stood, gouging deep scars into the stone. He hit the floor hard, rolling to his feet, blood pounding in his ears. Vyxara spun, claws out, and slashed at the beast, her movements fluid and fierce, tearing into its flank. The thing roared, swiping at her, and Jake grabbed a jagged rock, hurling it at the creature's head. It staggered, giving her an opening. She leapt, driving her claws into its neck, blood spraying hot and dark across the cave. But the beast wasn't done. It reared back, catching her with a glancing blow that sent her crashing against the wall, her shoulder slamming into the stone with a sickening crunch. Jake didn't think. He lunged, grabbing her arm and pulling her out of the beast's reach as it thrashed, collapsing in a heap of scales and blood. She stumbled, leaning into him, her chest heaving against his, her breath hot on his neck. "You saved me," she muttered, her voice low, shaky, her eyes searching his, confusion mixing with the fire still smoldering there. Jake grinned, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yeah, well, I'm not done with you yet." Her lips parted, but before she could snap back, a faint hum cut through the air, a drone, its red light blinking as it hovered above them. The council's eyes, watching, Vyxara tensed, pulling away, her voice hardening. "You're not weak. Not like I thought." She turned, limping toward the cave mouth, but her glance back lingered, doubt, raw and real. "Move," she growled. "They're coming." Jake nodded, following her into the dark, their fates tangled now, whether she liked it or not. Jake stumbled through the jungle's edge, his boots sinking into the soft, mossy ground as he followed Vyxara's limping silhouette. The twin red moons hung low, their bloody light filtering through the twisted branches, casting long shadows over the ancient ruins they'd stumbled into. Chiroprime's past loomed around them, crumbling stone pillars carved with glowing runes, half swallowed by vines that pulsed faintly in the dark. The air was cooler here, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood baked into the rock. His chest stung from the cuts she'd left, his shirt a shredded mess, but the adrenaline from the cave fight kept him sharp. Beside him, Vyxara moved stiffly, her shoulder bruised from the beast's blow, her leather armor scuffed and torn at the joint. They ducked into a narrow chamber, its walls etched with faded symbols, stories of Kyra's wars, maybe, or warnings long forgotten. The space was tight, barely big enough for two, forcing them close. Jake slumped against the stone, catching his breath, blood dripping from his arm where her claws had grazed him earlier. Vyxara leaned opposite, her crimson eyes glinting in the dim glow of the runes, watching him with a mix of wariness and something new. Curiosity, maybe. "Kyra's laws," she said, her voice low, rough from the fight. "They forbid me from sparing outsiders. You should be dead." She shifted, her chest brushing the wall, her leather creaking softly. Jake wiped sweat from his brow, grinning despite the ache in his bones. "Yeah? Then why am I still breathing, Vyxara?" He leaned forward, his knee brushing hers in the cramped space, daring her to answer. "You've had plenty of shots, back in that cage in the cave. What's stopping you?" Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't pull away, her breath steadying as she stared at him. The heat of her body radiated across the gap, her scent, leather, sweat, and that wild edge, filling the air between them. She turned her head slightly, her gaze tracing the runes on the wall, like they held some answer she couldn't find in him. "You're not like them," she muttered, almost to herself, her voice softer now, tinged with something raw. "The others, your kind, they beg, broke, bled out fast. You don't. Her eyes flicked back to him, sharp and searching, and for the first time he saw it. A crack in her hate, a question she couldn't shake. He chuckled, low and rough, shifting closer until their shoulders nearly touched. Guess I'm special, he said, smirking. Or maybe you're just soft on me. Her growl was instant, but it lacked the bite from before. She pushed off the wall, stepping into him, her chest grazing his, her face inches from his. Soft? She hissed, her breath hot against his lips, her claws flexing at her sides. I'd rip your throat out if I wanted. But she didn't move, didn't strike, didn't back off, just stood there, her body pressed close, her heat sinking into him. Jake tilted his head, meeting her glare. Sure you would, he said, voice low, teasing. So why are we hiding together, huh? Face it, you're stuck with me now. Her lips parted, a sharp breath escaping, and her eyes darted over him. His blood-streaked chest, his steady grin, the way he didn't flinch. You're a fool, she said, but it sounded weak, like she was convincing herself more than him. The runes glowed brighter for a moment, casting red light across her metallic purple skin, highlighting the tension in her jaw, the faint tremble in her hands. Jake leaned in, his voice dropping. Maybe, but I'm your fool now, Vyxara. The words hung there, heavy in the tight space, and for once she didn't snap back, just stared, caught in the pull of something she couldn't name. The chamber seemed to shrink as silence stretched between them, the glowing runes flickering like a heartbeat on the walls. Jake leaned against the stone, his chest still stinging, blood drying in sticky trails down his skin. Vyxara stood close, too close, her body inches from his, her leather armor creaking as she shifted her weight. Her shoulder was stiff, bruised from the beast's hit, but she held herself tall, her crimson eyes locked on him, sharp and restless. The air was thick, heavy with their heat, the drip of water from the ceiling echoing in the quiet. She took a step, closing the gap, her chest brushing his, her breath warm against his face. You talk too much, she muttered, her voice low, rough with an edge he couldn't place. Anger, maybe, or something deeper. Jake grinned, tilting his head. And you're still listening, he said, his voice steady, teasing. Guess that says something. He shifted, his knee brushing hers again, deliberate this time, testing her. She didn't pull back. Instead, she pressed closer, her hips grazing his, her thighs slipping against his in the cramped space. You're a dead man walking, she growled, her claws flexing at her sides, hovering near his waist. I could end you right now. Snap your neck, leave you here. But her hand moved, brushing his side, claws tracing the edge of his torn shirt, not cutting, just lingering dangerously close. Then do it, he shot back, leaning into her, his chest pressing harder against hers. You've got me pinned, go for it. His hands slid to her arms, gripping them lightly, feeling the tension in her muscles under the leather. Her breath hitched, a sharp sound, and her claws dug into his sides, drawing thin lines of blood that stung hot and fast. Don't touch me, she snarled, shoving him back against the wall. But her push was weak, her body following his, staying pressed to him, chest to chest, hips locked, her thighs still tangled with his. Jake laughed, rough and low, his hands sliding up to her shoulders, holding her there. Too late for that, he said, voice dropping, his lips brushing her ear as he spoke. You're all over me, Vyxara, scared of what that means. Her growl rumbled deep, and she twisted, slamming him harder into the stone, her claws pinning his wrists above his head. Her chest crushed into his, leather straining, her hips grinding into his with a slow, angry roll that made his pulse spike. I fear nothing, she hissed, her breath hot against his neck, her lips grazing his skin, close enough he could feel their heat. Least of all you. Then why are you shaking? He whispered, pushing back against her grip, his hips bumping hers, matching her pressure. You're fighting something, me or yourself? Her eyes flared, and she released one wrist, her claws sliding down his chest, tearing through the last scraps of his shirt, leaving it hanging in tatters. Her hand lingered, claws grazing his bare skin, tracing the bloody line she'd carved earlier, her touch rough but hesitant. "You're a fool," she muttered, her voice trembling, her thigh pressing harder between his legs, her heat sinking into him. "A dead fool who doesn't know when to quit." He broke her grip, spinning them until her back hit the wall, his hands pinning her arms, his body pressing into hers. She gasped a sharp, startled sound, and he leaned in, his chest crushing hers, his breath hot against her neck. "Maybe I don't quit," he said, voice rough, his lips brushing her jaw. "Maybe I'm not the one losing here. You're the one stuck on me." Her claws dug into his sides, drawing blood. But she didn't push him off. Her hips shifted, brushing his, her thigh locked with his, her breath coming fast and uneven. A sudden rumble shook the chamber, dust falling from the ceiling as a massive stone slab crashed down nearby, kicked loose by the jungle's shifting roots. Jake reacted fast, pulling her tight against him and rolling them out of the way, his arms wrapping her waist as they hit the floor. She landed on him, her chest pressed to his, her hips grinding into his from the fall, her breath ragged against his lips. "Don't touch me," she snapped, shoving at him. But her hands lingered, claws grazing his chest, her body trembling, caught between rage and something she couldn't name. He grinned up at her, hands still on her waist. "You scared of me now, Vyxara," he teased, voice low. "Or just scared you like this?" Her growl was sharp, but her eyes flickered, doubt, desire, a storm she couldn't control. "I'm not scared," she hissed, her claws pressing into his chest, her hips shifting against his, but she didn't pull away. "You're nothing, just a pest." Her voice wavered, weak, and she shoved him again, rolling off, but her glance back betrayed her, torn, raw, fighting a pull she couldn't shake. Dust settled in the chamber, the rumble fading as Jake lay sprawled on the stone floor, Vyxara's weight still pressing into him from their fall. Her chest heaved against his, her hips pinned to his, her breath hot and uneven against his lips. Her claws dug into his chest, drawing faint lines of blood, but her push to get off him was half-hearted, her hands lingering, trembling. "Get off," she growled, her voice rough, but her eyes, wild and conflicted, betrayed her. Jake grinned up at her, his hands still on her waist, holding her there. "You're the one on top, Vyxara," he said, voice low, teasing. "Make a move." Before she could snap back, a sharp whine pierced the air, drones, their red lights blinking as they swarmed the ruins, the council's cold gaze descending. Vyxara tensed, rolling off him fast, her shoulder wincing as she stood, but her glance back lingered, raw, uncertain. "They found us," she muttered, her tone hardening, though her eyes flicked to his blood-streaked chest, his steady grin. Shouts echoed outside, Kyra hunters, their boots pounding the jungle floor, closing in. She grabbed her bow, her movements jerky, but hesitated, looking at him. Jake pushed to his feet, ignoring the ache in his limbs, wiping blood from his lip. "Guess we're in this together now," he said, stepping close, his shoulder brushing hers. She snarled, but didn't pull away. "Move," she barked, shoving past him toward the chamber's exit, her claws flexing. The drones buzzed louder, and a plasma bolt scorched the wall near them, forcing them to dive behind pillar. She landed beside him, her body pressed to his in the tight space, her breath fast against his neck. Her eyes met his, sharp and stormy. "Why'd you stay?" she whispered, voice low, almost lost in the chaos. Jake smirked, his hand brushing her arm. "'Cause I don't let you die. Not yet." Her lips parted, a shaky breath escaping, and for a moment, she didn't move, just stared, caught. Then she nodded, gripping his wrist. "Fight with me," she said, her voice firm but soft, a crack in her walls. They rose together, ready to face the storm. Jake and Vyxara burst from the ruins into the shadow of Kyra Prime's black stone city, its jagged spires piercing the red-lit sky like knives. The air buzzed with energy, plasma reactors hummed deep within the towers, their blue glow pulsing through cracks in the obsidian walls. The jungle's edge faded behind them, replaced by cold, polished streets that echoed with their boots as they ran. Jake's chest burned, blood crusting over the cuts from their fights, his torn shirt flapping against his skin. Beside him, Vyxara moved with a limp, her shoulders still bruised, her leather armor scuffed but clinging tight to her metallic purple frame. Her crimson eyes darted ahead, sharp and focused, but her glance at him held something new. Trust, maybe, or more. They'd fought their way out of the ruins, plasma bolts scorching the air as Kyra hunters closed in, drones trailing like vengeful ghosts. The Council's grip was tightening, their orders clear: kill the human, punish the traitor. Vyxara had led them here, to the heart of her world, her bow slung across her back, her claws glinting at her sides. "The Council's tower," she said, her voice low, rough from the run. "They're there, waiting." She stopped at a massive gate, its surface carved with runes that glowed faintly, a barrier to the city's core. Jake caught his breath, wiping sweat from his brow, grinning despite the odds. "Guess it's time to say hello." She turned to him, her chest rising and falling, her leather creaking softly. "They'll call me a betrayer," she said, her eyes locked on his, steady but stormy. "I was their best, hunted for them, killed for them. Now I'm with you." Her voice cracked, raw and real, and Jake stepped closer, his shoulder brushing hers. "They're wrong," he said, voice firm. "You're stronger than they know, and they're about to find out." Her lips twitched, a faint almost smile, and she nodded, her hand brushing his arm, a touch that lingered, warm and sure. The gate rumbled open, revealing the Council's chamber, a vast hall of black stone, its ceiling lost in shadows, plasma coils crackling along the walls. 3 figures stood at the far end, their dark armor gleaming, faces hidden behind masks that glowed with red slits for eyes. The Council, their presence hit like a wave, cold, commanding, unyielding. Vyxara, one intoned, voice mechanical and sharp. "You've defiled Kyra's honor. This human filth ends here." Jake laughed, stepping forward, his boots echoing in the hall. "Filth, huh? I've heard better insults. Let's see if you fight as good as you talk." Vyxara moved beside him, her body tense but steady, her claws flexing as she faced them. "He's stronger than you think," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, firm and defiant. "You taught me humans were weak, cowards who break. He's not." Her eyes flicked to Jake, a spark there, pride, maybe, or something deeper. The Council's leader stepped forward, their mask tilting toward her. "You've fallen, Vyxara," they said, cold and final. "A traitor to your blood, your kin, seduced by this pest." She snarled, her chest heaving, but Jake caught her arm, his grip steady. "She's not fallen," he shot back, grinning. "She's just waking up." The hall trembled as drones buzzed in behind them, plasma weapons charging with a high-pitched whine. The Council raised their hands, signaling the attack, and Vyxara's eyes met his, fierce, alive, a fire he'd stoked since that cage. "We end this together," she said, her voice low, a promise in it. Jake nodded, his hand brushing hers, feeling the heat of her skin. "Damn right," he said, stepping into the fight beside her. The drones fired, bolts scorching the stone, and they dove for cover behind a pillar, her body pressed to his, her breath fast against his neck. She looked at him, her gaze steady, and for the first time he saw it, love, raw and unspoken, breaking through her walls. The Council wanted them dead, but they'd face it as one. The black stone hall erupted as plasma bolts lit the air, scorching the pillars where Jake and Vyxara crouched. The drones swarmed, their red lights blinking like angry eyes, firing relentless volleys that cracked the stone around them. Jake gripped a scavenged plasma pistol, snagged from a fallen hunter in the ruins, its hum steady in his hand. Beside him, Vyxara's claws glinted, her body pressed tight to his, her breath hot against his neck as they ducked another blast. "Stay low," she growled, her voice sharp but steady, her shoulder brushing his as she scanned the chaos. Jake grinned, adrenaline pumping. "Low's my specialty," he shot back, popping up to fire a burst at a drone, sending it spiraling into a wall in a shower of sparks. She snarled, lunging from cover, her movements fluid and deadly. Her claws slashed through a drone's hull, tearing it apart midair, metal screeching as it crashed. The council stood at the hall's end, their dark armor gleaming, directing the assault with cold precision. "Traitor!" one bellowed, their voice echoing over the gunfire. "You'll die with him." Vyxara didn't flinch. She grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him into a sprint toward a shattered pillar, plasma bolts sizzling past them. They hit the ground hard, rolling behind it, her body landing on his chest, crushing his hips pressed tight. Her breath came fast, her eyes locked on his, fierce, alive, burning with something raw. "Keep moving," she hissed, rolling off, but her hand lingered on his chest, claws grazing his skin through the torn shirt. Jake pushed up, firing at another drone, its wreckage raining down as Vyxara leapt again, tearing into a second with a feral snarl. The hall shook, dust falling from the ceiling, and the council advanced, plasma staffs crackling in their hands. Jake ducked a bolt, grabbing Vyxara's wrist and yanking her into an alcove, a tight nook in the wall, barely big enough for them. Their bodies slammed together, chest to chest, her hips grinding into his from the force, her breath ragged against his lips. "We're pinned," she muttered, her voice trembling, not with fear but something deeper. Her claws dug into his sides, holding him there, her thighs slipping between his legs, pressing hard. Jake grinned, his hand sliding to her waist, feeling the heat of her through the leather. "Pin's fine by me," he said, voice low, teasing, his lips brushing her ear. "You're still with me. That's what counts." Her eyes flared, and she shoved him harder into the wall, her chest heaving against his, leather creaking as she leaned in, her lips hovering near his, close enough he could taste her heat, wild, untamed, electric. "Fool," she whispered, but her voice cracked, soft and shaky, her claws tracing his chest, drawing faint lines of blood that mingled with the sweat. Before he could answer, a plasma bolt scorched the wall beside them, and she pulled him down, rolling them into the open as the alcove crumbled. They scrambled up, back to back, and charged, Jake firing at the drones, Vyxara slashing through anything in reach. The council closed in, their staffs glowing brighter, and one swung at her, energy crackling. Jake tackled her out of the way, landing hard, her body under his, hips locked, her breath hot against his neck. "Enough," she roared, shoving him off and leaping at the nearest council member. Her claws tore through their armor, blood spraying as they staggered back, staff clattering to the stone. Jake fired at another, the shot hitting a plasma coil on the wall. Sparks flew, and the hall shuddered, a section collapsing in a cloud of dust. Amid the chaos, he grabbed Vyxara, pulling her into a shadowed corner, their bodies crashing together against the stone. Her chest pressed to his, heaving, her hips grinding into his as they caught their breath. "I want you," he rasped, voice rough, his hands tearing at her armor's straps, exposing her metallic purple skin, smooth, warm, alive. She growled, her claws digging in his back, pulling him closer, her lips crashing into his, hard, desperate, a clash of teeth and heat. "I'm yours," she rumbled, her voice breaking, her body wrapping tight around his, thighs locking with his. They sank into each other, blood and smoke swirling around them, the fight forgotten for a heartbeat as their need erupted, raw, fierce, unstoppable. Her hands clawed at his chest, tearing the last of his shirt, her breath ragged against his lips. "Don't stop," she hissed, her hips rolling into his, and he didn't, pressing her into the stone, their bodies melding in the chaos, love and war tangled as one. The hall lay in ruins, smoke curling through the air as the last council member staggered, their mask cracked, blood pooling beneath them. Jake stood over the leader, plasma pistol smoking in his hand, a final shot ringing out as he hit the reactor core behind them. It exploded in a burst of blue fire, the blast shaking the chamber, toppling spires into rubble. Vyxara stepped beside him, her claws dripping red, her leather armor torn at the shoulder, her chest heaving from their fight, and what came after. Her eyes met his, steady and fierce, a fire burning there that wasn't just rage anymore. "You're done," she said, her voice low, turning to the fallen council. Their lifeless forms sprawled among the wreckage. "I choose him." The words cut through the silence, firm and final, her hand brushing his, claws grazing his skin, a touch that promised more than words could. Jake grinned, wiping blood from his lip, his chest bare and streaked with cuts. "Took you long enough," he said, stepping closer, his shoulder brushing hers, their heat mingling in the cooling air. She snarled, but it was soft, almost a laugh, her eyes flickering with something warm. Acceptance, love, unshakable now. The drones lay shattered, the council's reign broken, and the city trembled around them, its power fading. "They'll hunt us," she muttered, her gaze sweeping the ruins, her hand lingering on his arm. "Kyra won't forgive this." Jake shrugged, his hand sliding to her waist, pulling her close, feeling her warmth through the torn leather. "Let him try," he said, voice steady. "We've got this." Her lips twitched, a rare, faint smile, and she leaned into him, her chest pressing to his, her breath warm against his neck. "You're still a fool," she whispered, her claws tracing his back, gentle this time. "My fool." The hall was quiet now, save for the crackle of dying flames, and they stood together amid the chaos, blood-stained, battered but whole. The fight was over, but their story wasn't. They'd carved something new from the wreckage, something neither Kyra nor Earth could break. Hand in hand, they turned from the ruins, ready for whatever came next. The black stone city burned behind them as Jake and Vyxara sprinted through its crumbling streets, the air thick with smoke and the hum of a Cairo warship powering up ahead. The twin red moons hung low, casting their bloody light over the chaos, towers toppling, plasma reactors sparking out in bursts of blue flame. Jake's chest ached, blood crusted over his cuts, his bare skin streaked with dirt and sweat from the fight. Beside him, Vyxara ran with a fierce grace, her leather armor torn at the shoulder and hip, her metallic purple skin glinting under the moons. Her crimson eyes blazed, locked on the ship, a sleek, jagged beast of black metal docked at the city's edge, its engines rumbling to life. They'd taken down the council, left their bodies in the rubble, but Cairo wasn't done. Drones buzzed in the distance, hunters' shouts echoing through the streets. Vyxara had grabbed his hand back in the hall, pulling him toward this chance, this escape. "We take it," she'd said, her voice rough but firm, her claws grazing his wrist. Now, as they reached the ship's ramp, she stopped, turning to him, her chest heaving, her breath fast. "You broke my world," she said, her eyes searching his. Anger there, but something deeper, something alive. "Everything I was gone." Jake stepped close, his hand sliding to her waist, feeling the heat of her through the torn leather. "I didn't break it," he said, voice low, steady, his lips brushing her ear. "I set you free, and I'm giving you the damn universe instead." Her breath hitched, and she grabbed his shoulders, claws digging in, pulling him closer, chest to chest, hips brushing, her heat sinking into him. "You're insane," she muttered, her voice trembling, but her eyes softened, a spark of trust, of need, breaking through. He grinned, his hand tightening on her. "Yeah, and you love it," she growled, shoving him up the ramp, her body pressed to his as they stormed the ship's cockpit. The controls glowed blue, alien runes pulsing under her touch as she slammed a panel, sealing the hatch behind them. The ship shuddered, lifting off as plasma bolts scorched the hull, hunters firing from below, too late. Jake dropped into the co-pilot's seat, his hands fumbling over the unfamiliar tech, but Vyxara moved fast, her fingers dancing across the console, her shoulder brushing his. "Hold on," she snapped, her voice sharp, but her glance at him was warm. Partners now, bound by blood and fire. The ship broke through the atmosphere, the red glow of Kyra Prime fading into the black of space, stars stretching out like a promise. Jake leaned back, catching his breath, his eyes on her. Her metallic skin shimmering under the cockpit's lights, her chest rising and falling, leather straining with every move. She turned, meeting his gaze, her lips parting slightly. "We're out," she said, her voice softer now, raw with something new, relief, maybe, or the weight of what they'd done. No more Kyra, no more counsel. He stood, stepping close, his hand brushing her arm, feeling the warmth of her skin. "No more running," he said, voice low, his chest grazing hers as he leaned in. "Just us and whatever's next." Her eyes flickered, and she grabbed his neck, pulling him into her, her breath hot against his lips. "You're mine now," she whispered, her claws tracing his back, gentle but firm. "And I'm not letting go." The ship hummed around them, a new world ahead. And Jake knew they'd won more than a fight. They'd claimed each other. The cockpit glowed with the soft hum of the ship's systems, stars streaking past the viewport as Jake and Vyxara stood face to face, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. Her crimson eyes burned into his, fierce and unyielding, her metallic purple skin catching the blue light, her leather armor torn and scuffed from their battles. Jake's chest was bare, blood and sweat streaking his skin, his torn pants hanging low on his hips. The air was thick, heavy with their heat, the hum of the engines fading into the background as they closed the gap. Chest to chest, hips brushing, her breath fast against his lips. "You've got me now," he said, voice rough, his hands sliding to her waist, pulling her closer, feeling the firm curve of her under the leather. "What are you going to do with me?" Her growl rumbled low, primal, and she shoved him back, pinning him against the control console, the metal cold against his skin. Her chest crushed into his, her hips grinding into his with a slow, deliberate roll that made his pulse spike. "I want you," she hissed, her claws digging into his shoulders, drawing thin lines of blood that ran hot down his back. "All of you right here." He grinned, his hands tearing at her armor's straps, ripping them free. Her shoulder plate clattered to the floor, exposing her smooth, shimmering skin. "Then take me," he rasped, his lips crashing into hers, hard, desperate, a clash of teeth and heat that sent fire through him. She moaned into his mouth, her claws raking his chest, tearing at the last scraps of fabric clinging to him, her body pressing tighter, thighs locking with his, hips rolling into his with a need that matched his own. "Don't stop," she growled, her voice breaking, her lips trailing down his jaw, hot and hungry. The console beeped under his weight, lights flashing as they shifted, but neither cared. He spun her, lifting her onto the controls, her legs wrapping around his waist, pulling him in, chest to chest, her heat sinking into him. His hands slid up her back, claws grazing her skin as he tore at the rest of her armor, peeling it off her hips, exposing more of her, smooth, warm, alive. She arched into him, her breath ragged, her claws digging into his sides, urging him closer. "You're everything," she whispered, her voice trembling, her lips brushing his ear as she rocked against him, her thighs tightening around his hips. He growled, pushing her back onto the console, his hands gripping her thighs, spreading them as he pressed himself into her. Hard, unyielding, their bodies melding in a tangle of sweat and need. "Say it again," he rasped, his lips trailing down her neck, tasting her, leather, sweat, and that wild edge he couldn't get enough of. "You're mine," she moaned, her claws raking his back, drawing blood that mingled with their heat, her hips bucking into his with a rhythm that drove him wild. "All I want, damn you." The ship shuddered, a faint jolt as it hit a pocket of turbulence, but they didn't stop, couldn't stop. He pulled her closer, his chest crushing hers, his hands tearing at what was left of her armor, tossing it aside as she clawed at him, her legs locking tighter, her breath hot against his lips. "You're insane," she gasped, her voice breaking into a moan as he pressed harder, their bodies rocking together, the console sparking under them. "And you're with me," he shot back, grinning, his lips crashing into hers again. Fierce, possessive, a claim sealed in the chaos. Her hands gripped his neck, pulling him down, her thighs trembling as she arched into him, her moans echoing in the cockpit. Raw, desperate, unstoppable. More, she hissed, her claws digging deeper, her hips grinding into his with a need that burned through them both. He gave it everything, his hands sliding under her, lifting her, pressing her into him as they moved together, sweat and blood mingling, their bodies a storm of heat and want. The stars blurred outside, the ship humming beneath them, but all he saw was her eyes, her skin, her fire, his now forever. They collapsed against the console, breathless, tangled, her chest heaving against his, her claws tracing his back, gentle now, possessive. "You're all I need," she whispered, her voice soft, broken, her lips brushing his as the ship steadied, carrying them into the void. Jake grinned, his hand cupping her face, feeling her warmth. "Good," he said, voice rough, "'cause I'm not letting go either." Their love burned bright, fierce and unshakable, a victory carved in the stars. The warship streaked through the endless black, stars stretching out beyond the viewport as Jake and Vyxara stood together, shoulder to shoulder, their breaths still slowing from the fire they'd shared. Her metallic purple skin shimmered under the cockpit's glow, her armor discarded in a heap, leaving her bare save for the torn scraps clinging to her hips. Jake's chest glistened with sweat and blood, his torn pants low, his hand resting on her waist, feeling her warmth, a tether in the vast unknown. Kyra Prime was a fading memory, its red glow lost behind them, its rules and rage burned away. She turned to him, her crimson eyes steady, fierce with a love she'd never voice fully. "Not yet." "We're free," she said, her voice low, firm, her claws brushing his arm, a touch that promised forever. Jake grinned, pulling her close, his chest grazing hers, his lips hovering near her ear. "Free, and together," he said, his hand sliding up her back, tracing the lines her claws had left on him. "That's our win." She leaned into him, her breath warm against his neck, her body fitting to his like they'd been made for this. They sent a signal, short, sharp, back to Earth and Kyra, were proof no hate lasts forever. The words hung in the void, a legacy carved from their fight, their love, a bridge between worlds, a defiance of all they'd been taught. She grabbed his neck, pulling him into a kiss, soft this time, deep, sealing it. "You're still a fool," she muttered, her lips twitching into a rare smile. "My fool." He laughed, holding her tight, the ship carrying them forward. Two souls, one path, a story written in blood, fire, and stars.